Thank you, everybody.
So, Janet, did you ever expect to be on stage with two Bulgarian men in, the space industry?
Not in my wildest dreams.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thanks everyone for coming. I thought we'd first kick off talking a little bit about basically like the history of the space industry, and then in particular, hopefully on the slide behind us, and maybe I have to click, they'll show a overview photo of the NASA Kennedy Space Center. Back in the 1950s, as the United States was sort of kicking off its initial foray into space, they chose for some reason to put the Space Center in the middle of effectively a large swamp in Florida. And so I'd love to hear from you guys sort of why was that? Why back in the day did they basically choose to put it there as we were kicking off the Apollo days?
Yeah, so I'll start, and then Kiko will tell you the really smart stuff about the geography and orbital mechanics and everything. But so what you see in front of you is the place where space is happening, I like to say. Kind of on that triangle side on your right is the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, and then on the left, that big mass of land is Kennedy Space Center. And I like to start with that because for clarity, they are two separate spaceports, right? So the Department of Defense Space Force owns Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, and then NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, owns the property in the middle. And a lot of people, especially in the media, they'll refer to it as Cape Canaveral Spaceport or whatever. It is truly two separate spaceports. We have different authorities. The ownership of the land is between two different federal agencies, and Kiko probably mentioned how happy he is that he has two separate things to deal with. But yeah, we really do have a great partnership with our Space Force buddies, and there's not a single launch that goes off there without both of our parties providing some sort of service and support from it. But the reason in 1947, right after World War II, there was a missile test facility on the Cape side, and so it was missile testing. And so they had several launches, started with the V-2 rocket. Some of the earliest Mercury and Gemini and the early Apollo missions launched off that property. And then NASA became a agency in 1958. And then, so long about 1961, they started looking where are we going to launch our future Apollo missions from. So we looked, of course, down in Florida, East Coast, and right by this missile test range. So we bought, NASA bought 144,000 acres around that area and proceeded to build Launch Complex 39A and B. Those were completed in 1967. And so that became the Kennedy Space Center. Like I mentioned, it's 144,000 acres. It is on a wildlife refuge. And so our land is managed. We're very, very environmentally conscious. And so I will give it to Kiko to talk about why we're on the east coast of Florida.
Yeah. So people think that going to space is about going up. It's actually about going up and then going really fast, right? So the way you should think about being in space is like this constant falling, being in orbit specifically. So if I were to take a baseball and I were to throw it, it would eventually fall. If I took that same baseball, I threw it farther, it would still eventually fall. Well, if I took that same baseball and I threw it at 17,500 miles per hour, and we could get rid of atmosphere and drag, that baseball, by the time it started falling, would already be around the curvature of the Earth, and that's what being in orbit means. So when you see a launch, it's not actually just going straight up. You're basically going up and then accelerating super, super fast. And because rockets are generally giant bombs that are very controlled, fire goes out one end, you
not
go
always.
Out the other. Not always, but hopefully you want it to be controlled. It's important that you launch basically over an area that's unpopulated, especially in the early development days. So Florida is ideal because you're basically right on the coast of an ocean, or you're on the coast, so you can go over the water where you generally don't have mass populations. And you can basically launch to a wide variety of inclinations, and what that basically means is you can kind of put a satellite in a very specific orbit and wide-ranging orbits. And when you look at the orbital launch sites that the United States has, we really have two main ones, one in California, one in California in Vandenberg, just a little bit north of Santa Barbara, obviously here in Florida, and there's also one in Alaska. And those are the main sites, mainly because you're basically close to water. And that's why Florida has been ideal. you fast forward to, okay, why does a company like SpaceX now want to be at Kennedy Space Center? And the reality is it's the hub. It's where this nation has built its entire space program. So along with that comes some pretty awesome infrastructure, the support of our government partners that kind of have the process for what it means to launch a rocket, and then the talent, right? I mean, the best launch engineers and launch technicians are here in the state of Florida, also in California, and has really kind of enabled us to take that to, or help serve the uses for what SpaceX needs to do.
So yeah, fast forward 45 years after 39A and B initially get built. Space Center doesn't look that different in some ways from the early days. Like we transitioned over to the shuttle, but we weren't really changing that much about how NASA operated. It was still largely basically government run. And all of a sudden a crazy billionaire or now very effective billionaire comes in and decides I want to start doing sort of private industry here. Can you talk a little bit about just like the early days of sort of partnering with commercial industry and Kiko, your perspective from it as well?
Sure. So the picture that you have in front of you is the KSC landscape from 2011. And so even before the last space shuttle landed in July of 2011, we at the Kennedy Space Center started thinking about how are we going to transform to meet the needs of the future. And as you see there, everything on the site was really owned, operated by the government, and in particular at Kennedy Space Center, the Space Shuttle program. And so everything was paid for by them. They had a bunch of facilities and a bunch of assets. And so we had authorization under NASA to be able to enable commercial industry. So as we were looking at the ending of the Space Shuttle program and what was going to come next, we looked at we started with our facilities and our assets and said, okay, for our future programs, we're not going to need, and we had a whole list of them. And so we thought, and I established a front door to the Kennedy Space Center so that companies could come and meet with people who were familiar with how to do agreements. We had a legal team, we had finance people there, but we could have made the choice and said, hey, all these facilities, we're just going to let them rust and sit there, or we could see if there was commercial interest in coming in, using those facilities and making investments. And so that's what we did. In 2010, we put out our first, what we called Notice of Availability, and it had a whole bunch of things on it, including 39A. But our very first agreement was with the Shuttle Orbital Processing Facility, OPF. You imagine we had 3 shuttles at the time. As we were retiring that program, we didn't need 3 processing facilities. We only had 2 orbiters and then 1. And so our very first agreement in 2010 was OPF3. And then fast forward, we had 39A, which again was another coveted piece of property. And by the way, SpaceX competed for that. So there were other users who wanted that, but SpaceX was much further along in their launch program, and so we ultimately ended in turning it over. And I think if you go to the next slide, so fast forward 10 years, we looked at we started with our assets, facilities, and then we looked at land. Was commercial, as Kiko described all the reasons why coming to the east coast of Florida was a great place to launch or conduct your operations from. You can see on this picture all along the Cape side, the Cape Canaveral side, as well as on Kennedy Space Center property. There's a number of commercial companies that are now operating and launching from our facilities. And I will say one thing that usually isn't talked about a lot is we had to look at ourselves and our business processes, because if we had the most bureaucratic business processes in the knickers of all the commercial, they would not be able to be innovative and would not be able to conduct their operations as efficiently as possible. So when the shuttle, successful 30-year program, 134 flights, there's a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of rules, a lot of regulations, a lot of operational procedures that were built up over that time. And we took a look at them and intentionally at the Kennedy Space Center said, what is a minimum set that we have to require for commercial providers to come operate? Again, we could build the field or we could offer it, but if we didn't make it attractive, they wouldn't come. So again, we have a very, very vibrant spaceport today. I think in large part due to the way we reduced our rules and regulations. We had like some 30,000 safety regulations, and it kind of started with OSHA, and then it built on that and built on that. We reduced that and then handed over to commercial industry. If you're operating within your own zone, industrial operating zone, or within your own 39A, the confines of that, you're responsible. You're going to protect your people. You're going to protect your hardware. Provide us a hazard, the hazards that you're going to be conducting. If the hazards go outside of that area, you got to be a good neighbor. You got to let us know. For example, a launch, we have to schedule some support up for them, but they have to let us know so that we're all good neighbors out there. So very, very proud of where we are today in our landscape, completely transformed over the last decade, and now what we see is more and more consolidation, right? So it started out a launch pad, and there were vehicles manufactured and refurbished elsewhere, and space capsules, and now we're seeing a consolidation, not just SpaceX. Blue Origin has this huge facility outside our controlled access gates. Even the Space Launch System, the Artemis rocket that launched last November, they're starting to consolidate their operations closer to the launch head because, it is more efficient to have you can use the same workforce, but having it closer to where you're actually launching it, you avoid a bunch of transportation and other operational things.
So Kiko, you guys obviously launched your first handful of rockets out on a Hawaiian island in the middle of nowhere, where there's obviously, I think, very little rules. Talk about that transition to switching operations in the 2010, 11, 12 timeframe to Cape Kennedy. The pros, the cons. How's it been, sort of, let's say, the last decade working with them?
Yeah. So rockets are big. They can be big, right? Especially if you want to send big stuff to space. So there's some logistical challenges of trying to build a facility out in the middle of the ocean or something like that. So that, one of the reasons KSC is so advantageous is you can build the infrastructure around where you want that vehicle to launch. It's possible you can produce them somewhere if they're small enough that you could take over the road. Falcon 9 is. But ultimately, you want to be able to launch, you want to be able to land, and you want to be able to maintain those vehicles. And KSC kind of provides that entire ecosystem. We look at just Kennedy Space Center, but what you don't really see on this chart, I don't know if you can see it behind me, is Port Canaveral is actually a really important part of this too, right? Because a big core part of our business is having rockets be reusable, which means, remember we talked about orbital mechanics, we often take that first stage and it lands on what's called a drone ship, a big barge that we then bring back. So that's kind of part of that ecosystem too. The reality is SpaceX would not be where it is today without NASA. They have been incredible partners on multiple fronts. Janet's 100% right. They've really kind of laid some boundaries on, hey, here's the places where, the rules that we're going to play by. But otherwise, your vehicle, your operations, as long as it's not going to impact your neighbors or public safety, you guys get to go innovate in that box. And that's really allowed us to accelerate, especially over the last couple of years, where we've gone from launching 19 times in 2019 to 61 times in 2022 with the goal of getting to 100, right?
Earlier today, you had a launch attempt. Later today, you're going to have a launch attempt.
Correct.
So 2 in a day now.
Yeah, the ultimate goal, right, is to make space flight aircraft-like. That's the step function humanity needs to go through for us to become a spacefaring civilization. And we talk about it as a spaceport, but the reality is we're just trying to make it an airport, right? We're trying to make it what an airport seems like. And with that comes, fundamentally, you got to have the technology to do it. You got to have the infrastructure, and then you got to have the operations and also the regulatory set of rules to kind of allow it. A really interesting thing about operating at KSC, and I made this joke to Delian earlier, is Janet is my landlord, my supplier, and my customer all at the same time, right? Which is kind of an interesting relationship. And that means you're more of partners, right? You're not any one of those specific things. Instead, you're both working together to get to really the common goal of how do we push the boundaries of human exploration and capability as a country. I think if you go to the next slide, zeroing in on, the best example is Pad 39A. Now, 39A is, maybe certain people might argue otherwise in a different country, but arguably the greatest launch pad in the entire world. It's where we launched humans to the moon from. It was the first shuttle flight, It was the return to flight for America in human spaceflight with Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley in May of 2020. And I fully expect it will be the place where we launch humans to another planet from. And I think that, the fact that this pad meant so much to NASA, right? But given it's a historical artifact, I think we call it one, right? But that public-private partnership, those rules, those regulations that allowed us to basically partner and harvest this commercial company, which was us at the time, to be able to come on and reutilize that pad and then still serve a huge purpose for the space agency and our country, I think is this amazing example of a private-public partnership that benefits all at the end of the day. And we certainly are excited for the future, but even in the interim, launch today was going to be F-39A Falcon Heavy. That's 39A is where we launch our Dragon 2 vehicles, our human spaceflight program, and our Falcon Heavies. And I still get goosebumps every time I walk up to it, especially when there's a rocket. It's kind of like hard to believe that we have the opportunity to work on this pad, because I really do believe it's the greatest pad in the world.
And I'll just pop in. It wasn't easy, right? There were still people in NASA who said, no, we should preserve that pad because we might need a second pad in the future. And so, again, as I mentioned, we could have let it just rust out there, or we could have enabled commercial space. And I can't really even imagine a decade later where would we be without having given that pad to SpaceX, where now, we look brilliant because you're launching crew off there and, looking at Starship going forward, but cargo and supporting our International Space Station. But I will tell you, it was not hard. There was a lot of people who just, they thought that NASA might need that pad in the future, so just preserve it, and or a commercial company couldn't design, develop, operate, own, manage their own rocket.
Yeah.
And so incredible history, obviously, over the past, 50 plus years. Super exciting this past decade. Let's talk a little bit about the future, of space flight. Obviously, you guys just had, talk a little bit about the very interesting test that you guys did of Starship. And Janet, I'd love to hear from you how SpaceX can adopt a slightly different, let's say, risk profile and engineering approach relative to internally NASA-built rockets.
Yeah, so for those that were following along, we had the first sort of flight test attempt of our new vehicle, Starship, out in South Texas just last week. It was a successful test. There was a lot we learned. We didn't make it to orbit, but we did get off the launch pad, make it through max Q, which is the point of maximum dynamic pressure. And really, the goal of Starship is to develop a fully reusable system. Even Falcon 9 was an evolutionary piece of technology. We recover the first stage, we recover the fairings, which is the part that protects the satellite on top, but we still lose the second stage, right? What you need to do, and the right analogy here, right, is imagine if you were flying from New York to LA, okay, Miami to LA, and along the way the wings fell off, the tail fell off, and the only thing that landed at the runway was the fuselage, right, that had the people in it. That's basically what rockets are like, right? And in order to make that leap, we need to not have the pieces fall off along the way, and you need to be able to launch, land, rapidly recycle, and do it again. And Starship was really designed and built and is to take that major step to be a truly rapidly reusable system. So it was very exciting to get through the first test. We learned a lot. There'll certainly be some things we update and fix and go for it again. And then over time, we'll definitely want to diversify and, like I said, add capability at the Cape. And hopefully it'll be our next step towards being multiplanetary.
Yeah, and I would say we have really changed the way we do business at NASA, over the last decade with the success of first with cargo and then with crew. We procure a service. So SpaceX, we pay them for delivering cargo to the International Space Station, for getting our crew up there and safely back. We don't own, operate, manage any of that hardware. And we do that, again, by buying services and not by prescribing or building specific rockets. And so our next future, our next big step is to go back to the moon. to land on the moon. And so again, SpaceX won our human lander system. You know, we can get our people up there on the Orion capsule, but we're looking to SpaceX. We bought that service for them to land a human lander on the moon, and then obviously, of course, to send back and bring them home safely. So I would say across the portfolio of NASA's things that we do in space, we have changed the risk calculation because it's now just not a NASA risk and it's not our workforce, but we share that risk with our commercial provider. And that's where I think the partnerships and the change has really helped, because we get that innovation across the aerospace industry to come in and help us think of things in different ways. And we're contracting and doing things differently as well.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I cannot wait until we have boots back on the moon, and we've got a Starship, on 39A ready to launch, and should be soon.
Awesome.
There we go.
There we go.